Hi, and welcome to another midweek message. In Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 13, someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Then he said to them, "Beware, and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?' Then he said, 'This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared?' So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." In this parable, God calls this rich farmer a fool. I don't know of anyone who likes to be thought of, much less called a fool, but even far less to be called a fool by God. Because, in this case, he was not rich toward God. He gave no thought to the spiritual and eternal realities of his life. He certainly was a wealthy and productive citizen of the world. He had seemingly accomplished a great deal. By earthly measures, he was successful. But by any spiritual measure, the man was an abysmal failure. And because he had not weighed those things fairly, because he had not balanced his life appropriately, because he'd not given spiritual attention to the things that are of eternal consequence, God calls him a fool. Anyone, even today, who lives their life as if this life, that is, life here on earth, is all that there is or all that matters, will be called ultimately a fool. But that person is not the only one that God calls a fool. For example, in Matthew chapter 7, in verse 24 beginning, Jesus said, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." In this instance, Jesus refers to another as a fool, not because he has completely ignored all things that are spiritual, not because he has completely removed himself from a spiritual and eternal reality. In fact, he is one who has heard the words of Jesus. But this man's foolishness is not a matter of his attention, but a matter of his practice. It's not merely a matter of what he hears, that information that he admits into his life, but a matter of what he does with that. Jesus said a truly wise man not only hears the words of the Lord, but puts those things into practice. He hears and he does. James speaks of this in James chapter 1 as well. But Jesus said the man who hears, the man who receives spiritual information, who has his eternal perspective informed by the word of the Lord, but doesn't do anything with it, that man is a fool. A person who hears the gospel of Jesus Christ and never obeys it. Maybe he believes in Jesus as the Christ. Maybe he even repents of sins he's committed and makes good changes in his life. Maybe he even confesses Jesus and is unashamed to call him the Son of God before others, but he never gets around to dying to himself and sin in the waters of baptism, being united there with the death of Jesus Christ, being raised to walk in newness of life. He may hear, he may know the gospel, but he never puts it into practice. This person, Jesus says, is truly a fool. But equally foolish, the Scriptures say, are someone who has heard the word of the Lord and even begun to do it, but who has turned from it and begun to walk in error. In Galatians chapter 3 and verse 1, Paul addresses these Christians as you foolish Galatians. They had admitted false teaching into their life and their practice. They had begun to pervert, twist, change, and otherwise understand and teach the gospel of Jesus Christ outside of its purity and its simplicity. Paul says they're foolish for having turned from what they had in Christ to something that was less than what was the truth of Jesus Christ. The writer of the book of Hebrews addresses Hebrew Christians in very much the same terms, because they were turning from what was in fact better, everything better in Jesus Christ, to that which was ultimately inferior in the law of Moses. Spiritual foolishness is the greatest tragedy one can possibly imagine. Whether it is living as if there is no spiritual reality, no eternity that we will spend somewhere, or whether it is admitting spiritual truth into our lives but never acting on it in obedience to the gospel of Jesus Christ, or having obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ at one point but not living as the redeemed and new living people that we ought to be in Jesus. All of these are called foolishness. I don't want to be thought of as a fool by my friends and neighbors and family members. I don't want to be called a fool even by my enemies. But the greatest tragedy I can imagine is to die as a fool and to be identified as such in the day of judgment. What am I doing to prevent that tragedy? What are you doing to prevent that tragedy in your life? Live in view of eternity. Obey the gospel of Jesus Christ and live the life of a Christian. Thanks for watching.